January 18th. First thing on the agenda, I just want to note we got a couple new members, Representative Sawyer and Representative Francis. Welcome to the committee. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a different experience than most committees you've been on. I don't know if you've been on it before. Yeah, it's and you don't. It's hard to get an appointment on because you kind of got to leave before that opens up. So we've had a couple House members leave. Just want to let everybody know we're live streaming and their mics are hot. I want to thank, I don't know if there's anybody here from Kevin Barone's office. We want to thank them for providing the lunch. Just want to thank them for doing that. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to performance audits and evaluations. First thing, economic development. Josh, you want to go ahead? We got our little audit packet, so book.
All righty. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Josh Luthai, and I'll be presenting an audit looking at 5 of the Department of Commerce's major economic development incentive programs. Team members on this audit were Daria Malakina, Betty Liu, and Matt Fahrenbrook. Kristen Rottinghouse managed the audit. This audit was required under KSA 46-1137. That's the statute that requires us to do the economic development incentive evaluations. This is the final evaluation in that first 3-year cycle. Our main objective in this particular audit was to determine whether Commerce's major incentive programs generated returns that exceeded their costs. Those 5 programs were HPIP, JCF, KIT, KER, and PEAK. We estimate those 5 programs all generate total returns that exceed their costs. I'll unpack what that means in a little bit, but first I'd like to start out with some background information beginning on page 4. So first, a little bit about each of those 5 programs. The High Performance Incentive Program, also known as HPIP, encourages businesses to make capital investments, pay higher than average wages, and train their employees. Businesses that do these things can earn state tax credits or sales tax exemption certificates. The Job Creation Fund, or JCF, is Commerce's deal closing fund. It allows Commerce to make cash awards to businesses to incent them to do things like create jobs or keep their businesses in Kansas. The Kansas Industrial Training Program, or KIT, reimburses businesses for training new workers, and the Kansas Industrial Retraining Program, or KER, reimburses businesses for retraining existing workers who are at risk of being displaced. And finally, the Promoting Employment Across Kansas, or PEAK program, encourages businesses to create new jobs in Kansas. For doing this, businesses can keep or get refunds on 95% of the withholding taxes they would otherwise remit to the state on new qualifying jobs. So that's a very brief overview of these 5 programs. They're all a little different in terms of how they're funded. PEAK and HPIP involve foregone revenues, whereas the other 3 programs involve the expenditure of state funds, but they're all about incenting economic development, mainly through the creation or retention of jobs or through capital investment. If you do want to read more in detail about each of those programs, we have more information including eligibility criteria and program histories in Appendix C, which is way in the back on page 37. However, I'm going to move along to a few other pieces of background information. So first, Commerce and KDOR administer the programs we're discussing. KDOR is involved with HPIP and PEAK, but not the others, and that's because HPIP and PEAK involve tax benefits. Second, for a business to participate in JCF, KIT, KER, or PEAK, a business must enter into an agreement with the Department of Commerce. An agreement will include information about the maximum amount of incentives a business can earn, what the business has to do to earn those incentives, and how long the business has to meet its obligations. Commerce has discretion over how much a business can earn in incentives for each of the 4 programs. And if a business doesn't fully meet the terms of its agreement, it'll generally get a prorated amount of incentive, or in some cases, such as if Commerce offers a business an upfront loan, the business may be required to repay funds if it doesn't fully meet the terms of its agreement. HPIP works differently from the other 4 programs. Commerce doesn't decide how much a business can earn under HPIP. HPIP also doesn't involve any agreements with Commerce. Instead, there's a statutory formula that's based on a business's qualifying capital investments, and that's what determines the state income tax credits the business can earn. Commerce, instead, is responsible for certifying that a business's site is eligible for HPIP, and then once it's certified, the business will submit information to the Department of Revenue to do things like earn those state tax credits. And then finally, worth keeping in mind, a business can participate in just one of these programs or as many as all 5 at the same time. But a business has to have a separate agreement with Commerce for each of the programs it participates in. On page 7, we have some information about the incentives Commerce offered businesses in recent years and where those incentive awards went. I am, however, going to pass over that information and move on to talk about our methodology, which starts on page 8. So first, a very broad overview of what we did, then I'll go into the details. So the first step was to select 28 incentive projects to evaluate. For us, one project included any incentives a business received in fiscal years 2017 through 2021 from the 5 programs we evaluated. Some of the projects involved only one incentive program, others included multiple programs, and a few of the projects we looked at included awards from all 5 programs. So lots of different combinations of programs going on here. Then we used a research-based economic model to estimate the economic and fiscal impacts of each project. The model also goes on to estimate the economic and fiscal impacts that happen specifically because of the incentives businesses received. I'll talk a little bit more about that model and its calculations here in a moment. But then the final kind of broad step in our methodology was to use the project-level modeling results to estimate returns on investment for each of the 5 overarching programs. Our project selection was judgmental, so our results aren't statistically projectable, but we still think our selection allows for some useful insight into each program's performance. Going back to the model, like I said, we used a research-based model. That model was developed by Dr. Timothy Bartik. He's part of the nonprofit W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. He's a national expert on the impacts of economic development incentives. We consulted with Dr. Bartik during the audit. We also consulted with Dr. John Leatherman, who was previously a professor at Kansas State University. He also helped us out on our last economic development evaluation audit. And speaking of prior EcoDevo audits, the model we used for this audit is an updated version of the one we used for last year's industrial revenue bonds evaluation. So some of what I'm saying here might sound familiar to some of you. The model is pretty complex, so I'm just going to focus on a few key inputs and outputs in this presentation. Starting out with the inputs, there are 2 primary inputs. One set of inputs is the number of jobs created or retained. We used a combination of planned and actual job creation data for this input. We generally assumed any jobs created or retained would stick around for 20 years unless the evidence clearly indicated otherwise. The second set of inputs deals with the incentives businesses were offered and the incentives businesses actually earned. For agreements that were still in progress, because they generally take place over multiple years, we had to estimate the incentives businesses will go on to earn in the future. The model uses these inputs to estimate a but-for percentage. This is a phrase some of you may recall from prior presentations. And the but-for percentage essentially estimates the percentage of jobs a project created because of the incentives. The model compares the value of the incentives the business was offered to the total value of a project to estimate the but-for percentage. Based on those things and some other stuff, the model then produces 2 main outputs. One output is private sector economic effects, also referred to as economic impacts. Economic impacts are the economic effects businesses cause when they create or retain jobs. For example, creating new jobs provides workers income. This may increase demand in the economy, which may cause other businesses to grow and hire more workers. This could cause population growth that might in turn increase demand for real estate, which may go on to increase property values. The other output is public sector tax effects. This is the same thing as fiscal impacts. This output refers to the new tax revenues state and local governments collect because of the economic impacts I just discussed. So for example, new jobs or higher wages would mean more income tax for the state. But some of these new tax revenues may be offset if state or local governments need to spend more money to provide public services to a bigger population. That is, not all new tax revenues represent a net gain, and this is something the model tries to account for. You can add economic impacts and tax effects together to get a project's total returns, which is basically just a single number that tells you how much good stuff you got out of a project. And just to be clear, we estimated both economic impacts and tax effects over 20 years. The model then multiplies those two outputs by the but-for percentage to estimate the economic impacts and fiscal effects that happen specifically because of the incentives a business received. So for example, if the model estimated a but-for percentage of 10%, then the model would calculate that 10% of the project's total economic and fiscal impacts were due to the incentives. For the 28 projects we modeled, our but-for percentages ranged between 0.14% and 31.1%. Then, based on those modeling results, we calculated a return on investment for each program. Our return on investment calculations reflect how much in economic impacts and tax effects the state got for each dollar it spent or forwent in revenue on incentive awards. Our returns calculations are indicators of program success. When returns are above $1, it means a project or program will create more in benefits than it costs the state. By contrast, when returns are below $1, it means a project or program created less in benefits than it cost the state. So that's a very condensed overview of our methodology. If you do want more detail, you can find that information in Appendix B on pages 34 through 37. With all that in mind, and I do realize it's a lot, we'll get back into the answer to the audit objective. This information is going to begin on page 13. As a reminder, our objective here was to determine whether the 5 programs generate returns that exceed their costs to the state. And like I said earlier, we estimate the 5 programs will generate total returns that exceed their costs, but we think it's unlikely the programs generate enough tax revenues to cover their costs. So working into that in a little more detail, based on our modeling work, we estimate all 5 programs we evaluated generate total returns greater than $1. We summarize this information in Figure 3 on page 13. That table compares the total costs of the incentive projects we modeled by program to the total returns we estimated. And as that table shows, because all of the returns are greater than $1, we're estimating that each program creates more in benefits, in total benefits, than they cost the state. This suggests these 5 programs are generally successful. And we can also go a little deeper than total returns because, like I said earlier, total returns is economic impacts plus tax effects. So we can look at each of those 2 returns by themselves. That's in figures 5 and 6 on page 16. The first table, figure 5, deals with economic impact returns. As the table shows, we estimate all programs generate more than $1 in private sector economic effects for each dollar the state spent on incentives. Since these programs are meant to incent economic development, we think this is a good indicator these programs are generally successful. The second table, figure 6, deals with tax effects. And as this table shows, we estimate all programs we evaluated will generate less than $1 in tax revenues per $1 of incentive costs. This is why we don't think these programs fully recover their cost to the state. We estimate the tax revenues the programs are responsible for aren't high enough to offset the cost of what the state spent or foregone in revenue. On page 17, we talk a little bit about project level returns because so far I've been focusing on program level returns, but those program level estimates are based on the results we got for each of the 28 projects we modeled. To briefly summarize, most of those 28 projects had total returns greater than $1. Only 6 had total returns of less than $1, and those 6 projects either failed or they didn't create nearly as many jobs as anticipated. When you're thinking about these results, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, these are estimates. We're estimating what's going to happen over 20 years, and this requires us to make some assumptions about what we think is going to happen in the future. We also don't think it's appropriate to compare programs based on the returns we estimated. That one program's returns are higher than another program's doesn't necessarily mean the first program is better. These programs are different sizes, they target different needs, they're funded differently, so this isn't meant to be a which one is better sort of evaluation. That's a summary of our primary findings, but I do have a few other things in the report I'd like to point out. First, we surveyed businesses to get their perspectives on the importance of economic development incentives, among other things. That information is on pages 18 through 20. 30 businesses responded to our survey, and one of the things I want to highlight here is that one question we asked was whether businesses would have done the same thing if they hadn't received incentives from Commerce. 11 businesses said they would have done the same thing, that is, create a new facility in Kansas, hire jobs, whatever, even if they hadn't received any incentives. That is, incentives didn't make a difference to their plans. 13 businesses said incentives convinced them to do bigger projects or to do their projects sooner instead of later. Only 3 businesses said they would have canceled their projects or done them in another state if they hadn't gotten incentives. Our survey results aren't projectable, but we do think they're helpful in illustrating that incentives do not always make 100% of the difference. Sometimes they don't make any difference. This is why we think it's important to calculate but-for percentages and use them to estimate the economic impacts and tax effects that happen specifically because of incentive awards. On pages 20 through 22, we have a literature review and talk about whether other states have similar programs. There's a nice map on page 22 that shows that programs like the 5 we evaluated are pretty darn common in other states. So Kansas is certainly not an outlier here. And then finally, I would highlight that there is a tax credit, the owner's peak tax credit, and an HPIP fund that have never been used. We discussed those 2 items on pages 22 and 23. To kind of wrap this up, we did not make any recommendations as part of this audit. The Department of Commerce did choose to submit a written response. Their response is on pages 27 through 31, and that'll conclude my presentation. I would be happy to stand for questions.
Okay, Josh, thanks. First question, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have just a few questions for you. So on page number 9, when it says 600 businesses, is that the number that was provided from the Department of Commerce? And does it include those businesses that receive property tax exemptions locally?
That is based on data that Commerce provided. It's based only on businesses that got incentives from the 5 programs we looked at.
Okay. So again, just I guess we all need to keep in mind that there are lots. I don't even know the total number of businesses in Kansas. Does anyone know?
I don't. Maybe someone from Commerce, when they're up next, could elaborate.
Just out of context, was curious how many actually receive incentives. And then when we look at the but-for, I realize the models change. So how has the but-for piece of the model changed with this current versus the older one? Meaning, what are the main variable changes?
When you say the older one, are you referring to the IRBX audit from last year or to the 2015 audit? In the 2015 audit, the team used their professional judgment in consultation with Commerce and other experts to estimate a but-for percentage. Here, our but-for percentages are based on what the model estimates, so that's all based on mathematical calculation. That's research-based rather than professional judgment.
Okay, I'm not sure if I completely follow, but I'll let you maybe email me what you think those differences might be. And then the final question would be, for those percentages that estimate the but-for of the 28 different businesses that you looked at, how did that actually compare or seemed accurate compared to your survey, where it said 53% of the 30 who provided complete said that they would still have completed the project to some degree. So did you kind of compare those two?
I wouldn't say we compared them. I think they generally align, but because the survey was relatively small and not projectable, we didn't use that to influence the but-for percentages in the model. That said, I do think they align reasonably well with one another.
And I think that the but-for is the trickiest part for any policymakers to try to figure out if it would have happened anyway.
And to be clear, if I may, I mean, it's very hard for anybody to estimate since it's sort of unknowable. So it is a challenge.
Great, thank you.
Further questions? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple of questions and appreciate your presentation. One of the questions I would ask, is there any way that we can find out an approximate number of businesses that are participating in more than one of the programs?
I can provide that information for you, yeah.
Okay. And what programs, obviously. Then also, part of the question, did you include, when you looked at the tax cost, the basis for these programs, did you include other incentive programs besides just the peak HPIP
Only the 5 we looked at. So for example, if a business received a local incentive, that's not something we would have been aware of or included in our modeling.
Right, so that's not included in that tax cost, is the point I'm trying to make here.
Yeah, so anything that a business received prior to fiscal year 17, anything it will receive in the future, anything it received in those years that we didn't include because it was like a local thing, that's not in there. So this is very point in time and specific.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I had one last question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I think it's the PEAK program. It's $6 million. We capped it at $45 million. We had a previous Secretary of Commerce that was giving out $6 million a year and continued to increase. Did you guys take a look at any of the caps and where we're at in those parameters in these programs?
That's not something we looked at as part of this audit, and it's a difficult thing to calculate. It's something we were aware of, but because these PEAK agreements are ongoing, they can run for, I think, 5 to 10 years. Really hard to say whether a business is going to earn the full amount of what they were offered, 10 years down the line.
Okay, and I forgot, Mr. Chairman, in the meeting I was just in, they're asking for an extension on the Apex bill. And I find it interesting, I know that wasn't part of the audit, but is there any way we could get some of this information on that project?
On the Apex, it's in the schedule to be audited. The problem with the Apex, it's brand new, so there's no information. And so the newer ones, we got to give it at least a cycle or two before you can have something to audit.
I would agree. Thank you.
So I think there's very little information, and we talked about that in our subcommittee. We were trying to look at some of the ones that get overlooked sometimes, and we went through and built a schedule. You can share that schedule with, go ahead, Chris, if you want, but Apex is up there, we know that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation.
Representative Sawyer?
I have a question. On your 20 years, how did you determine that? You said that you made the assumption that they would keep these jobs for 20 years. Is there some kind of evidence that you used to come up with that number, or?
We thought that was the most reasonable time frame for you all as policymakers. It is a long time, but HPIP, businesses can carry the credits they earn under HPIP for up to 16 years. So we needed to let things go for at least that long to deal with HPIP. And 20 years seemed like a pretty good place to draw the line since, the model can do up to 80 years. But at a certain point, you imagine the world's going to be sufficiently different that it's just too long to estimate. So we thought 20 years was the most reasonable place to draw that line.
That can make a huge difference. If it's like 10 years, 12 years, that would change those numbers significantly.
Some of the credits weren't able to be used, if I remember right. I want to say Sprint, maybe could never use some of them. They just eventually fell off. But are there further questions? Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your calculations for ROI, from page 7 there, at the bottom of that chart there's an eye-popping $400 million awarded. But we've really only spent, in the small print underneath, we've really only spent $114, basically like a quarter of it. What did you calculate on the full 400 million, or the quarter, or somewhere in between, or how did you?
So when we were doing our modeling, we looked at actual data about the PEAK projects, how things had gone to date, and we used that actual data. And then we used that to make assumptions about what we thought was going to happen in the future. So for example, if Commerce offered a business, say, $500,000 in PEAK benefits, and the first few years show they're totally on track, they earned maybe half of that amount, then we'd assume they went on to earn the remaining $250,000. So our modeling results try and account for the maximum incentives we think a business will earn. Does that make sense?
So somewhere in between.
Yes.
Representative Tarwater, and then we do have Bob North here from Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 21, figure 7, you went through how many states have programs similar to each of those programs. Can you tell me how many states have all 5 programs or all 4 programs that can be used at the same time on the same business?
I could get information about how many have all 5 programs. I don't know. I couldn't necessarily tell you whether those programs can all be used at the same time.
Okay, and then I think recently we made some of these programs, the tax incentives, transferable. That was a couple of years ago. Did you take that into account, that even on the businesses that won't earn them themselves, they would be able to sell them?
So I believe you're talking about HPIP,
Yes.
where recently you all allowed people who have HPIP tax credits to transfer those. That transfer item only applies to businesses placed into service relatively recently, and those projects weren't included in our analysis, so that's not something that we had to account for, but it would affect projects going forward.
So going forward, the programs will earn even less because those tax credits will be used where otherwise they may not have been.
That's potentially true, yes.
Did you look at the effects of competing businesses, the effects on competing businesses in Kansas that are in the same industry but have higher costs because they didn't get these incentives?
No.
And can you tell me, of all the companies you looked at, how many of them are repeat users, have had a program in the past and then re-upped it, or have a different program now?
I could work with Commerce to get some of that information, and we only collected data for fiscal year 17 through 21. I imagine there probably are some repeat customers, and some of these programs are set up for businesses to be repeat participants. So for example, KIT, KUR, and HPIP work on one-year cycles. So business might participate in those 3 programs for multiple years in a row.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Representative Williams? Oh, who? Okay, he's next. Are there any further questions? Representative Probst?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you explain on Figure 6, where we're looking at the recovering the cost through taxes, what all is included in those figures as far as what taxes are included in that model?
That's going to be state and local taxes, so it'll include things like state income tax, property taxes that I believe both the state and local governments collect, sales tax revenues. There's probably a few other things I'm forgetting.
Specific to the company or the region?
This is going to be specific to the Kansas economy.
Okay, so you're looking from one year to the next and saying income tax or sales tax increased in aggregate?
Yes.
Okay.
Further questions? Not seeing, okay. We have representatives from Commerce, Bob North. You want to add something to the conversation? And anybody have any questions for Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Bob North. I'm the Chief Counsel at the Department of Commerce. With me today from my far left, Joseph Magura, who is our economist and kind of data analyst. Got Rachel Willis, our Director of Legislative Affairs. Nadira Patrick, Assistant Secretary, and Pat Lowry, who is our Director of Marketing. So in the interest of time, I'll try to be quick, but there are several important items and points that we want to make. So we agree with LPA that there's a positive ROI on each one of these programs. If you look at the last study that Post-Audit did of these programs, if you look at, we use Wichita State and its economist to evaluate our programs, and then this Post-Audit, all of those show a positive ROI, and that kind of corroborates our experience and the really unprecedented success that the state of Kansas has had in economic development. This time around, Post-Audit arbitrarily chose a new model, and that was the Bartik model, which you just heard about. This was really a drastic change from the model that was used last time, and we think that change results in an inability for this committee, for the legislature as a whole, for the Department of Commerce to really meaningfully evaluate our incentive programs. I think we think it's confusing and it would be helpful, in our opinion, to all the stakeholders if we chose a model and then stayed with that model. That would let you compare program success over time. Because if you, and I'll get into some of the specifics in a moment, but we've got the same programs that were measured a few years ago. We've got basically the same people administering those programs as we had a few years ago, and we have tremendously disparate results. And you've got to ask yourself, why? Is there a flaw in this model? Is there a flaw in that model? And I will point out a couple of those flaws that Commerce shows. But we want a tool that helps us administer our programs, and we think that will be most meaningful to you as well. I mean, Peak, for example, the last post-audit return on investment for Peak was 57-1. And now it is, I believe, right about 5-1. So that is a tenfold difference in ROI on Peak when it's the same program, same people, drastically different results. I'm going to use an analogy that's probably not completely apt, but it's like taking a 72-inch yardstick and measuring a football field and coming up with 50 yards, right, as compared to a 36-inch yardstick. So we just don't feel like that is as useful as it could be to any of us. Specifically to the Bartik model, as post-audit discussed, it favors larger amounts of incentives. The more the incentives for a project, the higher the but-for percentage. And we think that rewards overspending on projects, and that's contrary to how we run these projects and these programs. We want to give the least amount of incentives possible to recruit or retain a project to the state. And so having a methodology that rewards overspending on projects, we don't think makes the most sense, and that is not how Commerce is going to continue forward with our programs. One of the other flaws of the Bartik model that we think is important, and again, I'm not an economist, I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn last night, but Bartik does not take into consideration construction jobs and capital expenditures. So if you look at Panasonic, and there's other examples, there's going to be 16,000 construction jobs in the course of 2 years over in DeSoto. That's, if those jobs are an average of $50,000 a year, then that's going to be a really, really significant fiscal impact that's not going to be measured. And it's not just Panasonic. That's an extreme, but there's several billion other dollars of capital investment taking place in this state in this time period. That's the construction impact of those projects is not calculated by Bartik. Commerce has used, based on the last post-audit analysis of ROI, we use Wichita State, the economic center there, Jeremy Hill, to help us in measuring economic impact for specific projects before we make incentive proposals. Wichita State uses an M-plan model, which is very similar to what post-audit used the last time around with these programs. We ran a subset of the 28 projects that post-audit studied. We ran that through, had Wichita State run that through their model. Every instance, the Bartik model provided a lower return on investment. In every instance, you would think there'd be an outlier here and there, but no. Every instance, Bartik came up with a lower ROI. We support additional resources for post-audit. We feel like this group, the legislature as a whole, needs better studies, right? We picked 28 out of over 600 projects. You can't extrapolate from that nominal number of projects that were studied in order to have results that you can make legislative decisions based upon. We feel like there needs to be a much more robust body of work. And we recognize that takes resources, and we would support those additional resources. No one wants to go through another audit, but if we're going to do it, let's do it right. So you've got information that's data-driven and that you can use to make decisions about these programs. Being able to project and extrapolate is important. To that same point, the survey that was briefly discussed, 298 surveys, I think, and 10% of the respondents fully completed or responded to those surveys. And that's not a large enough number to make the results anything but anecdotal. And I'd compare that to maybe to a Yelp review. You know, a certain subset of people are going to respond to a survey, and might be some bias in there, some other reasons. So once again, we'd suggest much bigger survey with better participation rates, and acknowledge that would take more resources to do. So happy to try to respond to any questions.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have several questions for you. So on one of the findings on page 16, they hit the taxes, and it said that the tax effect was lower than $1 for the sample return on investment. So my question to you on that, does that indicate that there's a shift in employment if we're not seeing higher sales tax revenue from those workers, or we're not seeing a change in income tax that's significant? Does that just shift that employer A moved to location B? Not employer, I'm sorry, employee.
I mean, I can't tell you the extent of that. Maybe Joseph could, but there are, again, flaws in any model, but particularly in Bardic, and to the extent it's not capturing those tens and tens and tens of thousands of construction jobs and all the withholding tax and the sales tax and the secondary and tertiary funneling of that money through the state's economy. I think it's hard to draw conclusions from that.
Okay, I mean, I certainly can't argue with you at this point, but I would say that little piece seems to be maybe incomplete in the picture, and maybe doesn't paint as rosy picture as we would like to see. The second thought on, is there shifting in jobs when we provide incentives to one business? Is there a shift, and we talk about that often, of employees moving from one to another? And so my question to you is, as we're moving forward and we're looking at output, and I mean, creating low-skilled jobs versus high-skilled jobs, knowing right now in Kansas, we heard this last week, that there's 2.5 job openings for every one person available. Are you concerned that further incentives are going to not drive more people into Kansas, but just move Kansans from one job to another?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's worthy of probably further study. Most of our programs, thanks to the legislature, operate on at least a county average wage or higher, so that we are not incenting jobs that are below county average wage. So we are focusing on higher paying industries and occupations. You know, we feel like if we create 10,000 jobs that pay higher than average, then people that are in jobs that are paying a lesser wage, hopefully they move up and they're able to better provide for their family. that creates openings in those jobs and the jobs that they're leaving.
Do you know how many job creations have occurred last year because of incentive projects in Kansas? New jobs that were, let's say, promised in,
I can estimate that number's somewhere 14 or 15,000.
okay, 14 to 15,000. And that would be a good number for Commerce to have back to look at how many jobs are to be created annually through the incentives that are added annually. But what's concerning about that is just about, I think, less than a year ago, stats showed that we had 17,000 fewer people working in Kansas than prior year. So those things don't seem to be contributing to the, or helping like we want them to help. And then finally, the last thing you talked about, our need for a robust body of work, that we need to be data-driven. We need to have this good data. And so it's my chance to get a good plug on the transparency database. And I just went again, and it's still very much lacking detail. I can't print it unless I throw it in an Excel file on the things that I want. And just a quick look of one company to see the layering effects. I just chose one randomly. I couldn't tell exactly what they were receiving it for. And then here is the detail. I won't say the name of the company. Here is the detail. The name of the county, the address without the city. So for me not being from Wyandotte, I'm not exactly sure, where it is, or Johnson County, all the small Lenexa, I don't know. So I would like the address added, and then it has date certified. It says meeting wage requirements. That's the question. The answer is yes. That doesn't, that's not data for us. If we're talking about we need data, we need to be data driven, we need to be robust, this is not data. It's just yes. And then below it says met training requirements. It doesn't say yes or no. It just, maybe it's not relevant. Maybe they need to put an NA. And then that's it. So I guess my hope would be we are trying as a legislative body that is moving in and out of this role all the time to keep up with the things that Department of Commerce is doing, and yet we can't fully because we don't have the data. So I'd ask that that be a priority, maybe even come back to some committee and talk about that transparency data. And there is a piece that's missing on that still. I think the original bill, and Representative Tarwater would probably remember better, required that there also be property tax exemptions on there. And we were told initially that property tax exemptions, even though those are local, majority of those are all local, could be uploaded on it because again, we can't determine the layering effect and the true impact of incentives if we can't see that, and that's still missing. And I don't know how to get it, I just know that that was part of the original, anything over $50,000 in a program alone. So just some insights of how we can better help each other. Thank you.
We're starting to run short, but one quick question at a time. Representative Tarwater, and then I'm going to go Thompson, then Ware, and then we need to move on or we're not going to get our business done today. So that's all right. No, I'll make sure. Okay, go ahead, Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick, I would like to know from the auditors why they chose the Bartnick model over the old model. The Comfrey has kind of trashed that model, and I'm sure you can defend it. I was just wanting to hear from you guys to see why you chose it that way.
Yes, sir. Thank you. The last time we did this audit was 2014, so it's been quite a number of years. Times have changed, research has improved. There's been 10 years of results that have now been analyzed. And so, yes, we considered different models. We fell on the Bartik model because it's new and improved, basically, and it accounts for the but-for percentage. The model that the WSU expert uses and that Commerce uses and the one we used last time did not, and that's what Josh was explaining. We as staff tried to use our professional judgment to estimate it, but now that is encapsulated in a model which we think makes it superior.
Representative Thompson?
I appreciate all the work and all the information here to try to make some kind of a decision on this. I worked with models for years, and there's a lot of basic assumptions that don't reflect real life. To me, when evaluating a program, and you may have a different take on $1 is recovering the cost. To me, that's the metric we should be looking at with regard to these programs. If we're putting more money into the program than we're recovering, then it's not doing its job. The taxpayers need to receive some kind of return. Would you agree with that?
I mean, that's certainly a viable perspective, and I'd be more inclined to agree if there was a model in use that measured all of the tax attributes specific to your question that were created by a project.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I honestly am not sure what to do with this report. I've read it over and over, and there's no conclusion and there's no recommendation. When we switched models from the in-plan to the BARDIC, they're just not comparable. And there's fine print in that says, oh, don't try to compare the two, but it's human nature to do that sort of thing. I understand, what I would have really loved to have seen is that we redo and use the in-plan now and the BARTIC so that we had an apples to apples, and then have the BARTIC going forward so that we could have apples to apples in the future. And I understand that that wasn't possible because there are limitations on our auditors. And I'm really troubled by so few businesses being involved in this, 28 out of 600. And again, they say that it would have taken much more time to do more, again, a limitation. And throughout this, there's the words estimate, assumption, not a projectable sample, survey results can't be considered representative because it was only 30 out of 300. And do not understand, do not misunderstand. I am absolutely not saying that any criticism of the auditors, but I'm wondering if all of my thoughts really kind of gelled with this report, some concerns and some frustrations that I've had from some of the reports that we've gotten, is that maybe we're just, as the legislators, we are asking the auditors to do too much. They are spread too thin. My conclusion is that this is a 40-page report with limited utility. Okay. And my recommendation is that we either grow the audit department or we shrink the number or breadth of what we ask of them.
Yeah, I don't think we need to grow the audit department, but I think, this one's definitely confusing because we've changed the process. I think Senator Thompson made a pretty valuable point. I think, you can look at an audit and get 1,000,000 points of view. You can just keep asking more. I mean, right now I said on FI9, I just watched the banks go like this. Why? Regulations, more information, more documentation. Their IT department, their budgets are going through the roof. These businesses are dealing with the same thing. And then now they got a government agency wanting more information. I really believe we need to get it down to a simple few questions. Are we getting our dollar back? Are they creating the jobs? Are we getting, is that investment making a return? And I know people want more transparency, but how are you gonna have, you're gonna have to hire people to get that information, this information. I mean, it's just gonna be so hard to track. You're gonna have to hire a team of people to put the transparency out there for someone to look. What I wanna know is when the state is investing $1, it's getting the dollar back, return, jobs, et cetera, not get into the weeds and try to run the company. And I'll let you make a quick follow-up and then Senator Tyson, and we gotta move on.
Why don't we make it a requirement as participation in these programs that they do respond to our post auditors so that they can get a full evaluation? I mean, you get an incentive program, that's a small ask to me.
Well,
just a thought.
They normally answer to Commerce. We're doing an audit here to overlook of what Commerce is doing. And, the
Board of
more
Commerce,
things you make businesses do, does Missouri, does other states, there's similar programs, I mean, all throughout. And the more hoops you got to jump through, the more apps, they're going to drive the business somewhere else. But that's just my point of view of being a loan officer, loaning millions of dollars across the state to some of, I don't know of any of these businesses, but it could have been. But I know how businesses operate. Senator Tyson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the obvious, though, is that in the report, it states that several of these businesses did not need, or they only used the incentive because it was there. And that's the intriguing part to me. A very high percentage would have done the work anyway. And that's the key, because as the chairman said, it's what return are we getting on this? Well, I would say zero return if the business was going to go ahead and do the work anyway. So I appreciate you looking at the new methodologies. When I was working on my master's in engineering, we had new technology. We could get to a donut shop. We could tell you what day they were going to sell the most chocolate donuts. You guys are being innovative and looking forward, and that's what we need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any further questions? If not, then let's move forward. We also, sorry, I took my glasses off here. We have officials from Department of Revenue, if there's any questions for them. Don't see any. We need to move on to the next piece of our agenda. Committee organization, re-electing our chair. Chris, you want to go ahead and go through the process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So each year, the leadership changes. The chair is from the House in odd-numbered years. This is an odd-numbered year. The chair and the vice chair must be from 2 different houses. And we have a third member who makes up the executive committee, and no more than 2 of the 3 can be from the same party.
Okay.
So a few little rules.
With that, I will take nominations for chair. Do I have a nomination? Representative Williams,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I nominate Representative Tarwater.
do I have a second? I got a second by Senator Tyson. Any questions or comments? Do I have any further nominations? Not seeing any. Do I have a motion to vote by acclamation? Representative Williams made the motion. Do I have a second by Representative Francis? Okay, all in favor, say aye. Against, nay, passes. Okay, the chair is, you want me to just run the meeting through? Or? Okay, do we have a nomination for vice chair? Senator Tyson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would nominate the chairman, I apologize, Senator Olson.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second? Williams seconds. Okay, do we have any further nominations? Do we have a motion to vote by acclamation? Senator Corson makes the motion, Francis seconds. Okay, all in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Against, nay, passes. Okay, and then our third member to the executive committee, Senator Corson?
I would nominate Senator Ware.
Okay, do we have a second? I'll second that. Okay, do we have any further motions? Not seeing any. Do I have a motion to vote by acclamation? Corson makes, Thompson seconds. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Against, nay, passes. Okay, we got our new executive membership. Let's move on to, is it tab A?
Yes.
Okay.
It's also, every biennium, the committee decides whether to adopt the current committee rules. Those are in tab A. So we would need a motion to adopt the committee operating rules.
There's no new rules, right? They're all the same?
Same.
Looks like, and one of the things I advise the new chairman, get with Chris, there's some really perks of being chairman, like the 100-hour committee, that kind of stuff. Do I have a motion? It's the same rules. Okay. Senator Thompson makes a motion. Senator Corson seconds. Any questions or comments? They're the same rules we're running under right now. Okay, not seeing any. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Against, nay, passes. Okay, we'll move on to the consent calendar. Go ahead, Christian. Turn to tab B.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So yes, if you'll turn to tab B, there are two things on today's consent calendar. One of those is approval of the minutes. The last meeting was December 12th. So the second item is acceptance of the performance audit completed today, which is the major economic development programs to the Department of Commerce. So just a reminder to everyone, and then those of you who are new, there's actually no action required on this, but if you were to object, you have the option to object to either of those things, in which case it would be taken off the consent calendar, voted on separately, or members may abstain from voting on the minutes if you so choose.
Okay, questions for Christian? Not seeing any. Would there any member like to abstain the approval of the minutes? Or is there, not seeing any? Is there any motions to object? Not seeing any? Okay, we'll consider that approved. We'll move to our additional business next meeting date. Chris, you can turn to tab C, and I'll let Chris take.
Yes, thank you. I'm speaking from the document in your notebooks in tab C. Just a real quick recap of what's coming up. We're busy wrapping up election security part 1 and groundwater management audits. We expect to release those in February. I'll be working with our new chair on setting a date for that. Coming in March will be child support enforcement. Coming in May will be the second half of election security. And then unknown dates at this point, we're just getting these started. These are the last of the ones you approved last year, which are community college athletics, working from home, and the follow-up audit.
Okay.
Just giving you a heads up.
Any questions? And our next meeting date is next Wednesday.
We have a new meeting next Wednesday. By statute, the Department of Commerce has to come make a presentation to this committee in January of each year. So that is what is happening next Wednesday. That's the only business next Wednesday.
And since I'm the vice chair, I'll get lunch.
Okay. And then one more thing, Mr. Chair, real quick before we go. I just wanted to recognize we have an anniversary. Our IT security manager, Katrin, is just last week celebrated 25 years with legislative post-audit.
Wow. Congratulations. You got the watch, huh? Well, again, thank you. And if I see no other business, we are adjourned.